about here, that means Russia. It says Italy will be destroyed for the most part, and millions of people will be homeless. The religious leaders will meet a brutal death for the most part. The Pope will flee across the waters of the Atlantic. He's actually going to hide out in South America somewhere, in Brazil, I believe. The Red Flood, the Russians will roll through Hungary, Austria, Switzerland, and Italy from the east of France in order to be conquered, says, by the hammer and sickle carriers. So the Russians are going to be a little busy guys, but of course it doesn't look very likely that that part could happen right now because Russia's really not together. So consciousness maybe has changed, maybe some extraterrestrial influences have happened, and as I've always believed, most of this won't happen or won't be nearly as bad as it's written here. It says the American weapon depots in France will fall into the hands of the Russians, and they'll take those over, and it says this will be at a time which Bolshevism will rule there for a longer period of time, and it leads the war against England, Spain, and Scandinavia, so everybody's going to fight. This war will be terrible for the whole entire world, but especially for France and the rest of Europe. Plagues and diseases unknown to at that time will appear raging across Europe, which will be caused by the bacteria and radiation from the weapons of the war. The young people will be especially affected and will experience blindness, madness, or complete destruction of the body. Germany will suffer an attack from the east, from the GDR, through which a civil war will flame up in which German will fight against German. The Russians, in their order also, France will invade Norway and Sweden, while Finland will be invaded and conquered as well. It says GTE Borg, Getborg, will be French red, and the two kingdoms will be totally defeated in this war. They'll have to relinquish their northern territories to the Russians from the east. All of the countries bordering the North Sea and England will be destroyed by a terrible flood, which is caused by the flood bomb and by a hurricane. Cities and villages are going to submerge under the sea and will lose most of Scotland. England's position as a world leader will be totally destroyed forever, as the Russians from the east will cause a revolution to break out in England itself, whose bloodiness will greatly exceed that of the German Civil War. South Wales will be defeated through revolts and a pouring out of blood. Ireland, it says, bleeds to death in a murderous war. America will be thrown into another war with Canada because of political complications, and a massive attack of the Red Flood on America has the result that the largest part of the U.S. troops have to fight in their own country and can't run and help out poor Europe. But running to the aid of Europe, it says, would be senseless anyway, because through the use of the newest weapons, America will be for the most part destroyed. So we're talking again here about the Chinese people developing weapons that actually ignite the air. It says through nature catastrophe weapons, elemental weapons, of whose existence in 1981 only a few people know about, terrible and horrible hurricanes will be released on the American continent. So they're not talking about bombing us, they're talking about elemental weapons which are going to cause hurricanes that we just won't believe. It says it'll crush and destroy everything in their path. These hurricanes are connected with monstrous gigantic waves of fire. Creeping barrages, it says, which will race across the land and eat everything in debris and ashes, because of which everything will be destroyed. One of these giant hurricanes, however, says the biggest of all of them, will ravage and destroy absolutely everything. And what it doesn't destroy, it will fall mercifully before the roaring inferno of the following wave of fire. So apparently there's going to come major hurricane with huge waves over the American continent, followed by waves of fire. It says the hurricane will race northward across the American continent. It'll suddenly change its course towards the northeast. It'll race across the continent, sweeping and destroying everything. It'll move out into the Atlantic, where it will cause a raging storm with such a high tidal wave that observers will say that it looks like a huge mountain. It heads straight towards Europe. Following the hurricane, which is head straight for Europe, then the beginning of recorded history. So since the beginning of recorded history, nothing like this has ever been seen. The flood races over England and the states of northern Europe in order to destroy everything. Let cities, villages, people, animals, and islands sink, while the hurricane itself follows consistently its northeast course, racing towards Spain and the Mediterranean. which there it destroys everything also. The hurricane then continues and doesn't even peter out till it moves clear over into the east somewhere. It says that 2/3 of humanity will die through this third world war. It will be in the billions. In the coming time, it says America will experience 2 civil wars, which will divide the country politically into 4 to 5 parts. Should the already threatened and very soon expected world war end without destroying the entire world, then it can only be because the power hungry of the world powers will come to a compromise. Otherwise, every living thing on the planet Earth must die. It goes on to talk about also the world fire, apparently these elemental weapons which are going to be unleashed, setting the atmosphere on fire. Flood also into southern Germany and starts burning everything, it says, to the end, and the Donau will be destroyed. Now, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. It's spelled D-O-N-A-U. It says that'll be destroyed and leveled to the ground. The rivers literally lose their water, so nobody even needs to use a bridge anymore. The hellfire burns the land so much that the land is actually steaming, that there's so much death and destruction. There's so many bombs hit Germany. So apparently somebody's really upset with Germany. If that happens to be the Chinese, then their new elemental weapons are going to take their toll out on Germany, because Germany's a total goner. It also mentions Switzerland, says churches will become stalls for the horses of the Russians, even in Switzerland, where religious places of the sects and cults will be used to store the weapons of the Russians and will lie in horse manure a foot high. Hunger, distress, disease, sickness, plagues, and destruction will break out over Russia, as well, and the powerful of the land will find death. Well, Russia is no more, so it'll be interesting to see if maybe parts of it unite, or maybe just some part of Russia. Maybe the old KGB will rise up to defend itself and get involved when the Chinese begin to attack. Most of World War III seems to attribute the fact that the Chinese will take some particular moment to attack into India, wipe it out, and continue the war. So it says the last and most significant sign for the start of the Third World Fire will be a political murder, which will take place in a country of the East. Just a short time afterwards and overnight, then the enemy will very quickly invade the countries, such that defense will no longer be possible. So it sounds like that the Chinese may actually murder whoever's running India at the time to cause confusion and immediately invade into the country and overrun India. Only a very few people will be in the position to flee and get out, and the destruction will rush in like lightning, completely unexpected and surprising. 3 main waves of the Russians will cross over into Europe like a 3-headed dragon. The lower head will go through Czechoslovakia and then head to the northwest, make its quarters in the Nab Valley in Germany. The second head will roll straight west and overrun the country. It will push on into Saxony and then go straight across Germany. The third head of the war dragon of the Russians will come roaring from the northeast to the southeast and destroy everything in its path. The main target of the Russians seems to be just wiping out Germany, as well as when they're wiping out Germany, suddenly from the south there are, it says, swarms of hornets flying over the heaven. That thousands of metallic shining messengers of death screamed towards Germany and exploded and burned Germany completely to the ground. So apparently the Germans have upset a few people, and the Russians are after them, and the Chinese are after them, and the Arabs are after them. And it talks about total destruction with neutron waves and 3R radiation with roaring fire that brings destruction totally. There's a gigantic corridor of death, it's called, will stretch from the south to the north, from Czechoslovakia up to the North Sea. It's caused by the Chinese. There's so much destruction that all life is extinguished. No life form can even cross into it. There's so much disease, bacteria, and radiation in there that no one goes into that zone at all. Goes on to talk about there's no snow on most of the mountains. It's all yellow. There's a deadly color, it says, contained in from bacteria and disease. Most of the weather is gray and rainy at this time. And there's so many deaths, it's just amazing. There's plagues and poisons. There's plagues arriving out of the disease from so many bodies, which we have no defense against, and take a terrible toll. It says Italy and France will be shaken by the sans culottes, whatever that is. who will destroy any semblance of order with killing and burning. Interestingly enough, Paris will be gone. It'll be destroyed by its own people. The inhabitants themselves apparently will just burn it down. Perhaps we'll see something like what we saw in Los Angeles with the riots here. So apparently Paris is going to fall into the same problem. It says that the church leaders will be massacred in France because of the cowardice of the Pope, and he hides out. Well, actually, the Pope has already run and hidden, taken off for South America, leaving all of his churches to be burned to the ground, and the Catholic religion pretty much is just all gone. Part of Scotland will sink into the sea when a gigantic flood rages over the whole land. High as a mountain, it says, it pulls everything underneath itself, destroying and bringing death, in order to make different islands sink into the wild waters. So Scotland's not a good place to be. Talks about murder and mayhem all over the east, and it goes on for a long period of time. Then, interestingly enough, it says towards the end of it that the Pope says the people of Earth will, after the end of the world fire, says there's not hardly anybody left. 2/3 of the people are dead all around the world, and most of Europe is totally gone. And the Pope will then come out of hiding in South America and try to take over again and reestablish Catholicism, so once again he can have control over all the people that are really left. But it's a very dangerous time. At that point, people are just, the ones that are left are, I guess, apparently just stunned by all the war. And there's going to be a lot of cults and a lot of things, different religions springing up and trying to reform themselves to take control over the planet. The same old stuff that caused the war, once again, is going to try to get a hold of it. Well, I think that's about enough for the prophecies, especially the World War III part. These prophecies were 76 through 81 they were given. Time has gone by, consciousness has changed. Even though there may be some war, I have no doubt that it will not be that bad whatsoever. I don't think the world is really heading for its destruction like it's portrayed here. Although it is quite possible that the Chinese might do something. At the moment, we've got the old Chinese in power, and they're coming into Hong Kong in '97. So we'll have to be careful and see if they do take the opportunity to actually invade into India, as this suggests. I'm also aware that even our own government, the CIA, and our own powerful people are probably just as aware of these prophecies as anybody else, and they have to be. And I think anybody who's been watching for the last few years has grown up with all sorts of prophetic things, either in the Bible or whatever, made aware to them. So I think even if some of these things begin, like if China does begin to attack or a war breaks out in Europe, something can probably be done to stop it. I don't think there's any way it's going to lead to the destruction that we're talking about here. But I thought if nothing else, I felt obligated to at least tell you what's in the prophecy book and try to laugh it off and lighten it up a little bit and learn to just keep yourself in the light. Learn to develop your spiritual self and get that inner feeling of confidence and reliance, and this will mean really nothing to you. It will just appear as just a story that couldn't happen to you. And by any means, do not let any sort of fear or anger swell up in you, because you won't be affected by this. As long as, no matter what happens out there, as long as you can spiritually keep yourself in a point of light and surround yourself with your own energy of light, then you won't be affected by all the fear, hate, and anger that gets unleashed during these coming times. Okay, well, if you haven't burnt yourself off completely from these tapes now, there's a few more to go. And I promise you that all the rest of the tapes are far more uplifting and more positive than this one is. And again, just remember that prophecies are just warnings. It is interesting to note, though, I'm curious, though, to see if some sort of civil war does kind of rise up in America. Our recent elections aren't suggestive of a civil war, but they're certainly suggestive that people are starting to take more of an interest in the country. They're distrustful of a government. They're distrustful of a government that keeps hidden bases, secret things from them. We know the government's been lying to us for years. There seems to be some separation of power within our own government, where certain levels of the CIA and NSA seem to be operating cities underground and large groups of people that are outside the law. It's even suggestive here in UFO circles that we could be on the moon or Mars with small groups of our own people who are trying to live above and beyond the planet Earth. Using Getborg will be French red, and the two kingdoms will be totally defeated in this war. They'll have to relinquish their northern territories to the Russians from the east. All of the countries bordering the North Sea and England will be destroyed by a terrible flood, which is caused by the flood bomb and by a hurricane. Cities and villages are going to submerge under the sea, and will lose most of Scotland. England's position, they'll take those over, and it says this will be at a time which Bolshevism will rule there for a longer period of time, and it leads the war against England, Spain, and Scandinavia, so everybody's going to fight. This war will be terrible for the whole entire world, but especially for France and the rest of Europe. Plagues and diseases unknown to at that time will appear raging across Europe, which will be caused by the bacteria and radiation from the weapons of the war. The young people will be especially affected and will experience blindness, madness, or complete destruction of the body. Germany will suffer an attack from the east, from the GDR, through which a civil war will flame up in which German will fight against German. The Russians, in their order also, France will invade Norway and Sweden, while Finland will be invaded and conquered as well. It says GTE bored by the hammer and sickle carriers. So the Russians are going to be a little busy guys, but of course it doesn't look very likely that that part could happen right now because Russia's really not together. So consciousness maybe has changed, maybe some extraterrestrial influences have happened, and as I've always believed, most of this won't happen or won't be nearly as bad as it's written here. It says the American weapon depots in France will fall into the hands of the Russians. That means Russia. It says Italy will be destroyed for the most part, and millions of people will be homeless. The religious leaders will meet a brutal death for the most part. The Pope will flee across the waters of the Atlantic. He's actually going to hide out in South America somewhere, in Brazil, I believe. The Red Flood, the Russians will roll through Hungary, Austria, Switzerland, and Italy from the east of France in order to be conquered, says